been a big week for both me and AI. The big news is Claude's new model. Welcome back to the idea supply chain, where we take a look at where ideas come from and what makes those ideas valuable. So this week has been pretty monumental, I'd say. Not only in the overall world of AI, which I think it has, but also in my own personal world in a lot of different ways. And so I kind of wanted to share both and how they're kind of interweaving right now. So in AI, the big news is Anthropic just released Claude Sonnet 3.5. Sonnet is their middle of the road model. So their smaller one is Haiku, their larger one is Opus. And so one of the things that is really surprising about this is 3.5 Sonnet actually has a better benchmarking score than Opus. It's actually well above GPT 4.0 right now, and it really seems to be the new state of the art model. I've only played around with it a little bit so far, so from what I can say, it is fast. Their whole thing is it's twice as fast, so it's not only smarter, it's twice as fast and 1/5 the cost, which is a huge cost reduction. Now, that being said, the one issue I've got with Anthropic is how much they limit what you can put through it in terms of number of requests. I have been limited so many times. The way I do things, I like to do a lot of smaller requests. I typically build my prompts in such a way that it's very, very narrow and focused. I'll do multiple step prompts to really make sure that everything I get is the output that I'm looking for. Now, the problem is Anthropic is pretty highly rate limited unless you have a big spend with them. I'm not in a position to actually spend a ton of money right now. So in that case, I'm just pretty limited. But I've been doing actually a lot of work in their workbench area. So similar to GPT's playground. And I've been really impressed with Claude lately. There are a few different things that stood out to me, but the most important one, I think, is that Claude seems to have a better understanding of where we are in the world today, whereas GPT seems to be a little outdated in some of its thinking. And yeah, first of all, there is the knowledge cutoff. 3.5 Sonnet, I believe, goes up until like April of this year. And so it's actually very, very recent in terms of where the training data goes up to. But even beyond that, I think with GPT, you end up by default 5 or 6 years in the past in some areas. And the biggest area I've noticed this is when you tell it to write a tweet. And I know that's weird, but the one thing that GPT loves to do is it loves to throw hashtags into tweets. I don't know if you've been on Twitter lately. Nobody uses hashtags anymore. And they're certainly not throwing 3 or 4 in there. Now, when I ask Claude to write tweets, it doesn't use hashtags. Instead, it breaks it down into the right size chunks. It has a better understanding of how language is evolving. And this is actually something that's really fascinating to me, because I was listening to a podcast interview with Ellen Fishbein, who I've actually been working with and in hopes that she'll be the publisher for Engineering Generosity. And so she actually said something that I thought was, really interesting to me, because it's not something I'd ever considered before. But she said that, poetry is actually like the forefront of language. So it is where language evolves. And man, like that's such a powerful thing, because then she went on to talk about how Shakespeare used the sonnet to be able to test ideas, test different phrases. And so he's got all of these sonnets that he used that are small, and for a smaller audience, because, when Shakespeare was writing, not a ton of people could read. And So he's got this smaller audience where he's testing out these ideas in this very, very constrained form. And then she actually compared the sonnets that Shakespeare wrote to the tweets of today, these highly constrained formats that force you to improve your craft. And so, because you've got these constraints, you have to work really hard to get powerful ideas packaged in to the available constraints. Um, and that kind of just blew my mind. Like, I'd never thought of that before. Like, I've read some Shakespeare, I've read some poetry, including actually Ellen's. Ellen has a fantastic book of her poetry called Spacefaring that she used as a test subject for her, like the printer that she was working with down in Texas. And it's an absolutely phenomenal book, actually. When I say I've got it, I keep it next to me because it's such a phenomenal book. Highly recommend that you check that out because uh, she plays around with all sorts of different things that I never would have thought of with poetry. There's a poem on imposter syndrome. Um, there's one talking about like our addiction to technology, and how that works. She actually plays with contrast at times where suddenly there's a black page with white text as opposed to kind of the normal. Um, and so when I heard her actually talk about this, it really gave me a different way to think of language and constraints and all of that. Um, Other fun fact about Shakespeare, uh, turns out like he decided to, he was one of the ones who actually created the Globe Theater. He found people around him to invest and open the theater. That way he had control over the theater that he could put his plays in. And then, so it's actually this very entrepreneurial like character from 1500s, I believe. And it kind of blows your mind because that's not typically how we think of uh, artists, playwrights, these legends, but there's a reason that they are the ones who persisted as long as they did. Um, and when you really dig into that, that is an absolutely like fascinating thing. And I kind of tied this in because of Claude Sonnet, and then Shakespeare sonnets. But I think understanding that language is this really uh, rapidly evolving thing right now, uh, because language evolves alongside technology. And that kind of gets into why this was a bit of a big week for me, because on Wednesday, I actually had the privilege of being invited to a panel to talk about AI. And I'll be honest, like I joined and I was pretty intimidated when people started to introduce themselves. We had people who had worked at OpenAI. We had people who worked at Microsoft. We had an AI researcher who just got a paper accepted and was speaking at like a big conference. Um, and then there's me. And I'm very, very confident in my ideas. And I understand where those ideas come from and how I'm working on proving those. But I don't have the pedigree. I don't have the historical signs that prove that I'm someone worth listening to. And so at first I felt, imposter syndrome. I wasn't sure if I belonged. But I took a deep breath, and then as the host asked questions, I started answering those questions and I started sharing my ideas. And I realized that like I wasn't that far off from what the researcher was saying. I maybe went a little more extreme in some cases. And in other cases, I went pretty far extreme from the norm. But I was able to hold my own in those discussions. People weren't looking around going, what is this guy doing here? They're like, oh, actually, that's a really well thought out answer. And I'm going to need to consider that some more. And so, you know, some insights that I have that I wanted to share from that. One of the big ones that I ended up talking about was this idea that more data isn't going to be the answer. We're going to reach a limit on what more data can teach you because it's all focused on language, these large language models. And language is rapidly changing. And so if you have a model that's not changing as quickly as the language is changing, it's not going to seem as intelligent. And we do a lot of these benchmarks around intelligence, and we try to like match them to, how does this perform compared to the average high schooler or the average college student or the average, post grad, PhD, whatever. But I don't think that's actually how to measure intelligence or anything like that. Um, for me, language is a way we can create a highly compressed model of the world that we're in. And so the language has to reflect the current world. It means you can't compress all of today's information into a model that was trained yesterday. There's more information coming all the time, and that information is changing the way we talk about it. It's changing the language we use. 20 years ago, if I would have said I tweeted something, people would look at me and go, "Are you a fucking bird? Like, what are you talking about?" And that's what I'm talking. That's what I'm talking about, because we're not going to have our language slow down evolution so that it can be trained on models, and therefore, in order to get a truly intelligent model, it's not about how much information you pack into its understanding of what the world is. It's how much filtering you do. And more importantly, intelligence ends up being a function of a network of different viewpoints of reality communicating. Because in order to really understand the world, you have to look at it from different viewpoints. You have to have filtered out different aspects of the world. And when you do that, the combined viewpoints of multiple views of the world around you end up being this shared reality. And that shared reality is actually what's valuable. And so when I'm talking about the value of information, it needs to be as up to date and truly representative of what's there as it can be. And what we're doing right now is we're training a bunch of AI models on incomplete information, leading to AIs that have an incomplete understanding. And there's a lot of things that go into that, but that's why I talk about building abundant systems, because abundant systems don't value specific outcomes in the moment. They look at the whole range of outcomes and they optimize for speed and efficiency of communication. If there's a problem, it's because information didn't get communicated efficiently or effectively somewhere. So we need to dig in and figure out why that is. And, we don't want to take all of these highly compressed packets of information that we call money, and we keep these in like very discrete pockets where people are waiting for specific times to pull their share out. And that's kind of a weird way to look at it too, because information is a very continuous thing. It's not this discrete, package that we can pick up every so often and get a truly like representative view of the world, because again, the world's always changing. We're constantly taking new information in, and we're using that to update our worldview. And to me, that's what consciousness is. That's what intelligence is. It's something that is not static. It is always learning. It is always taking more in. It's compressing information. It's, simulating. It's taking a vision of what could be in the future. It's a possibility, and saying, okay, let's imagine that that's the reality. What steps do I have to take to get there? And then, so you're essentially synthesizing the information. If you've heard the concept where, we're talking about using synthetic data sets to help train AI models better, it's kind of like imagination, because you're imagining that this situation exists in the future, and you're trying to put all the data in that would make that a reality so that you can actually enact that in the world. Now, the world is a highly complex system, which is why it's very, very hard to do this. And I say this as someone who is terrible at predicting how long it'll take to do anything. But I think for me, that is really what I'm building toward. And people are starting to understand that. I'm actually starting to get buy-in from people who I really respect and look up to, which is huge for me because I haven't always felt that way. I felt pretty ignored. Um, and that kind of leads me into the last thing. So I've been talking about engineering generosity, the newsletter, the community, and the lab. So this is what I'm building out for this season of Build Space. We're just finishing up week 1. It's all about the idea. I talked about that in the last video. But I've realized that I maybe need to increase the scope of what I'm doing. And part of me is yelling at me right now in the back of my head saying, what do you mean increase the scope? You're already doing way too much, do way more than you can handle. You're struggling with a lot of different things right now. What do you mean increase? And for me, one of the things that came out of getting feedback and kind of iterating on the idea slide was that I want to create a movement. I want to push forward an abundant agenda. I want people to see generosity so that they become generous. And one of the things that I've really figured out here is promoting generosity in community aspects, but also like it can be a good economic play. And I came up with a good concrete example that I'm running an experiment for. And honestly, it hasn't gone as well as I'd hoped, but I think it's a good way to start thinking of the problem that I'm trying to solve. And so there's a creator that I really admire. His name is Jay Klaus. I've been following him for ever, it seems, pretty much my entire creative journey. He hosts a podcast and YouTube channel called Creator Science. He writes, he's got a blog, and then he's got a community he calls the Lab, which, if you see, there's similarities to the lab that I'm building alongside Engineering Generosity too. And I would love nothing more than to work with Jay. I've messaged him a couple times about ideas I had, and things like that. And unfortunately, it hasn't quite worked out. But there's another issue in that he's about ready to become a dad for the first time. And to me, I get that. I'm a dad myself. He's not going to want to start anything new. He's having enough issues focusing on making sure his business is up and running, sustainable, so that he can probably take time off to be with his kid once it's born. And I totally get that. But I wanted to showcase an idea here of being generous. And, a lot of times we think of doing work as coming to an agreement beforehand, doing the work, making money, and, kind of getting paid for the work that you do based on an agreed upon value. But that has an issue, right? Because let's say I've got this contract in place and I'm expecting to be paid $5,000 for it on delivery. And I deliver that, and I've planned out I have access to this $5,000 in the future. What happens if the person decides not to pay me? Or maybe they're like a lot of companies and they'll pay me eventually when they get around to it. Now, the problem is, like, as an individual who's like a freelancer, or contractor, whatever, that can be really detrimental. And we don't always see that when we are, inside of large companies. Like, bills get moved around, they get transferred between departments, things get lost, you're waiting on this, waiting on that. But that can actually be really impactful for, freelancers. And it's one of the big complaints I've seen with freelancers. And so you would think that it would be a better idea to get things in writing so that you have recourse to, sue or whatever if things don't go that way. And that's the way I used to think too. But that's a scarcity mindset. That's saying that we need to have an idea of the value up front before the work is even done. Now, my proposal here is to shift that thinking. And so instead of waiting for some agreement with Jay and putting that in place, what if I just started doing the work ahead of time? And so, on his podcast, he's interviewed all of these really, really great experts around all sorts of creator ideas. And, they talk about different platforms, different mechanisms. He's always super transparent with what he's doing in his own business, the experiments he's running, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I wanted to take that information and turn it into something more valuable. And so I started with the idea of a tool for YouTubers, because some of the recent episodes, he's had April and Alter, who honestly, like, she blows me away with her ability to create YouTube videos that perform. She started her new channel around the same time as I started this one, and she's popped off in ways that I honestly didn't believe possible. And so, again, I know that she knows what she's talking about because I've seen it in action. And then there's a guy named Jake Thomas who does titles. He's really, really specific and has done all this research into what makes a good YouTube title. And then there's Patty Galloway, who has worked with all these top YouTubers. He kind of has an understanding of how channels work and all of this. So there's all of this really powerful information packaged into these interviews. And so I said, what if I took that and built a tool for YouTubers? And so I've been actually building that tool out. And so my idea was, I'm going to run a pre-sale for it. And if I can make $1,000 off of this pre-sale, then I'll go ahead and build the tool. And then the generosity comes in with, I want to give half of this to Jay. Whatever this tool makes, like, he's going to get half of the revenue if he does absolutely nothing with it. And maybe that'll turn into something, maybe it won't. But here's the cool thing, because one of the things is that, like, this isn't the only tool that I imagine. And it can be something that's either like a SaaS tool where it's being sold to, outside users, or it could even be a tool that is like specifically for members of his lab, his community of creators that is capped. And that could be like an added value bonus. And, I would be happy to build more for him. And, if the first one works and I have this, 50% revenue share, it would be fairly easy for him to just be like, oh, we'll just keep that money and build out more stuff for me. And so I've basically raised money from potential users, given him the ability to invest without actually having to invest, and then, growing the value that he's creating. And this is where I talk about the idea of abundant systems, because abundant systems rely on the concept of doing the work and trusting that things will work out. And the more pressure you put on systems to behave in very, very specific ways, the less likely it is that it's actually going to play out the way that you want. There's all of these constraints. You can't trust things. You have to enforce them. But with abundant systems, the whole thing is like, the maximum value is in the future. And so any like negative behavior by participants just says, oh, I don't want to share that future with them anymore. And so you cut them out of any potential abundance in the future that you have. It's a filtering mechanism. And so by doing the work first and then asking what people value it as, you get a much more accurate view as to whether or not that person views your work as valuable as you believe it is. And it gives you the power to do the work that you believe in first and not worry about all of the outside constraints. And this is really what I think is a very, very, very powerful concept. Um, there is so much that you can do with this idea because it's about what you know and what you believe in and what you're willing to do. Because you know what? I am one of Jay's biggest fans. I want him to be as successful as possible. I tell everybody I know about his content. I'm sharing his podcast and everything. And it doesn't matter if he actually values me or not, because I'm also using this as a way to evaluate how good Claude 3.5 haiku is, or sonnet rather. I've been using haiku primarily, but I've been starting to test out with sonnet to see if I can make that any better. And so he's put all this incredible information out into the world that has been extremely beneficial for me. I believe it's extremely beneficial for other people. Um, and so I'm going to build stuff, and maybe it'll work out, maybe it won't. Honestly, I haven't gotten the visibility I wanted on Twitter yet. And so one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to drop a pre-sale link to that in the description here, just in case that's something that you're interested in. It's not a lot. It's just enough to help me figure out if the demand is there before I actually build out this tool. Um, and on another kind of related note, the other tool that I've been building out this week is one based on the writing I've been doing in Foster. So as part of that, Foster's this writing collective that I'm part of. It's been so, so beneficial to help me as a writer, to help me work through a lot of, my internal issues that I've got. And one of the things we do as part of our weekly writing circles that we're part of is we do a somatic check-in. We see how we're feeling in our body. And by starting with that and then going into a meditation and then going into the actual writing, the writing that I create is much more powerful. It's much more tied into who I am and what I want to write about. And I don't do that at all anytime I'm not in the writing circle. That's bad for me. And so I've actually been building out a writing tool where it allows me to do a check-in with myself before doing anything else. So it brings me to the check-in. How are you feeling today? With a place to type in that part of it. And then once I submit that, then I get a document and I can do my writing. And then once I finish writing, I can save the document, which is important because one of the things that I'm going to do with it is I'm actually going to take all of these documents and actually their associated check-ins and put those into a vector database so that I can do really easy searching across it and be able to, find different ideas related to how I felt at a given point in time or what ideas I had, how those correlated, and then be able to pull in like various snippets of text and then use those in future writing because that's something I'm really bad at. I've got writing all over the internet. And one of the things I realized was earlier this week, I was compiling all the writing I've published on money. And I ended up with over 100 pages of text from all these different places where I talked about it. And I'm pretty sure I've missed a lot, but it's all out there somewhere. And I have no idea where. And I typically don't go back and look through stuff. And so by putting it into this like searchable place, it's also going to allow me to be more effective. Next step is to take all of my Google Docs and import those in. That's the next piece because while I'll be missing kind of the somatic check-in portion, at least all of these random untitled documents will be searchable. And I have a lot of untitled documents. I don't know about you, but most of mine end up being untitled because I open up a Google Doc, jot down whatever random ideas from whatever I'm doing. I jot down notes when I'm in meetings or classes, cohort sessions for Foster, whatever. Got all this writing everywhere, and it is not organized. And as I'm trying to build out engineering generosity, I, want to make this more effective. And so really excited about this because this is a product for me. Again, I'm doing a pre-sale on it. If that's something you'd be interested in, I'll drop that pre-sale link in the description as well. But then also that's something that will be offered to members of the Engineering Generosity Lab. And so you can do a pre-sale for $15 just to reserve some access, show me that you're interested so that I know that it's worth building like into a bigger product. I may actually even work with Foster to see if that's something they want to create with me. They've got a Chrome extension that works in Google Docs, but maybe they want their own editor that has the semantic check and things like that. So I don't know. I'm doing the work before I've actually validated any of these partnerships because it's people that I want to work with. It's ideas that I believe in propagating. And so, I'm happy to do that. And then that kind of takes me into the final piece, which is I guess I'm launching an Engineering Generosity podcast next. And so it started when I was sharing the idea of engineering generosity with my Twitter audience and getting feedback on the idea slide for Build Space. And, somebody was like, you kind of lost me at newsletter. It's like, I like audiobooks. And so, because I was talking about like the fact that, it's leading toward a book and all of that. And then I was like, I kind of wonder actually how Substack does podcasts. Is it like a full-fledged podcast? Is it just like an audio rendition of what you write? What does that look like? Well, it turns out it seems to be a pretty full-featured podcast platform. But then I got a message from another friend who I had previously talked to about doing some music for this YouTube channel when I was thinking that this was going to be more of an actual podcast. And, he gave me some prices or whatever, and then actually came back and was like, you know what? I'd be happy to do that just for free for you. And then maybe you can help me like promote a new album I've got coming out, things like that. And so I ended up having a conversation with him the other day because I don't have a great grasp on like taking music and saying, I need music that fits this vibe. And so this is what I want. He does. And so we had a conversation about what engineering generosity means. And so I talked about kind of, the vibe of optimism for the future, right? A belief that things will work out the way they need to work out. People being generous with each other because they feel that the world will be generous with them. Another phrase that's come up a lot for me this week is abundant systems are all about maximizing value as opposed to minimizing costs. So when costs are just a subset of value created, it doesn't matter what the costs are as long as the value created is more. And that's something that I think is a very different way to look at the world because everything is about budgets. We have this much budget. What can we do with that? And then, that gets broken down into like these sub budgets for these other teams. What can we do with that? Whereas, in the case of maximizing value, it's like, what can we create? Okay, now that we can create that, what resources do we have available to make that happen? And then it's like, you realize, okay, so, in order to create Y, I need X resources. Right now I have Z resources. So what's the first step I can do for Z? How can I turn Z into X? And it's a future focused mindset. It's, the abundance mindset systematized. And that's why I believe so heavily in this. And so I'm going to be doing this podcast. And so the other thing I'm going to look for, I haven't really liked the idea of getting sponsors, but honestly, I'm looking for different sources of income right now. I've got a lot of long-term things in play. And man, it can take longer than I thought. I'm bad at predicting timelines. I said that earlier. And so one of the things I thought about that would be interesting for engineering generosity is I'm going to accept sponsorships, but you can't pay for you to sponsor me. You can pay for somebody else to sponsor me. And so, what I want to do is I'm going to solicit sponsors who want to highlight other people doing things that they believe in. And, it's a different way of doing things, but let's be honest, I do everything differently anyway. And so that fits in. Anyway, I know this was a long video. We covered a lot of topics, but I wanted to give a more comprehensive view over everything that I've been thinking about, everything that I'm doing, because it's been a crazy week. And honestly, this is helping me process as much as anything else I've done. And so, the great news is I've heard people tell me multiple times over the past couple weeks that they could listen to me talk about this stuff for hours. So I'm putting that to the test on my YouTube channel. Actually, not quite hours. We're only just over 35 minutes here, it looks like. But hey, I know it's much longer than my normal videos, but I think it's worthwhile. I hope this was valuable. As I said, I'll throw the pre-sale links up if that stuff that sounds interesting. It's fully refundable if stuff doesn't get built. But honestly, most of it exists at this point. So, the YouTube tool, if that's something interesting, I do want to get $1,000 in pre-sales just to make sure that that's got enough demand. The writing tool, I want to figure out the demand there, but again, I may end up working with Foster on that. So basically, this is just a way for people to secure early access. It's cheap enough. You pay. You can help me develop the tool. It's not going to be a monthly thing until, I kind of get it ironed out as to what that product looks like and all of that. And if nothing else, go to engineeringgenerosity.com, sign up for the $25 a month community tier, because that's going to get you access to the lab where it's going to be the writing tool. It's going to be various aspects of the YouTube tool. And specifically, I'll actually talk about how I'm pulling some of this information out of podcasts and give you the tools to actually do that. And so you can kind of see how these blocks are used and what I'm doing, and then you can use those yourself. And so that's the portion of the lab that comes in there. And then as the community grows, I'm going to really expand it into anything I can. It's, again, maximizing the value for the community. I'm calling people in to create this generosity, movement, this abundant future movement, this optimistic movement. That's what I'm all about. It's all about the optimistic future for me because we have the power to create it, and it's all about just doing so. So I want to put that playbook into your hands, and we're going to make the world a brighter place. But I can't do it alone. I need your help. And so if any of that sounds interesting, hit me up, leave a comment, find me on Twitter, find me on Substack. I'm all over the internet. It's hard to miss me. I'm noisy. I'm doing everything. I'm doing everything everywhere all at once, right? Just like the movie. And so if that's something that you're interested in being part of, I'd love to have you because we need everybody on our side to really make the future a brighter place. So if you're still here, I appreciate you. In the words of Up for the Challenge, go have yourself a cookie. Anyway, that's it for today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.